This is the second year since COVID that we've hosted this event. And last year was really special and felt special. And this year has the same feeling for me. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all here. Incredible surroundings, an incredible sense of history. And I look forward to you enjoying and producing a compelling evening. For me, some part of the evening some of the objectives have already been achieved. I discovered something in talking to my friend Mike Hobday, that if you produce code from ChatGPT for your application, you don't actually own the intellectual property for that code. That in itself is a game changer. I'm delighted to welcome Adam Tooze as our main speaker. Tonight's event is about being in the company of cutting-edge thinkers and an experienced panel to get a richer view of what's happening in the world so that we can all develop better strategies for our organizations and our business. Another friend of mine, Howard Foster, is in the audience, and on the 17th of March 2020, Howard called me and said, "Billy, I'm really sorry, but you're going to have to take all of your team off site." It was the beginning of COVID. And from January, where we had planned a 50% increase in business, and my first trip to Cheltenham, I ended up for the first time in my life with no business. Nothing. And many of us went through something similar during that period. The impossible happened. And Lennon, I think, said, there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. And I feel we're very much in one of those moments right now. Come the moment, come the man. Adam Tooze is going to speak to us tonight about what's happening in the world. He's a renowned author, writer, produces a fascinating blog, and a compelling speaker. What's interesting about Adam for me is that he's a living economic historian. He doesn't observe history, he lives it. He's right in the middle of it as it affects him, as it affects us. And he talks about the changes. It is history in action. And it's a very different way to look at history and look at what's happening. But in a moment in time when things are changing so fast, it's a really, really interesting person to listen to. One of the ways that we cope with the world at the moment is we find voices who are able to anticipate what's happening. And Adam is one of those voices. And I look forward to hearing what Adam has to say this evening. On the speaking panel, we have 4 speakers joined by equally interesting people. Richard Davies, CEO of Allica Bank. I think about Richard as an ambitious innovator who wants to create the revolution of the SME banking sector, which will be transformational. Catherine Sheridan, who's a pioneer in the new world of climate change and delivering energy in that world. And she's a pioneer not only in her business, but in her personal life in that regard. Basil Scarsilla. Basil is the person responsible for our energy this evening, along with providing the energy to something like 10 million homes in the Greater London area. He's a fascinating, wise, interesting man with a really interesting perspective on life. He was also on the board of FIFA for many, many years, and that's a really good subject to talk to her about. And lastly, Fernando Flores, Dr. Fernando Flores. Fernando has really compiled about 5 or 6 lives into one. He was Minister of Finance in Allende's government in Chile. in the early 70s. He ran the largest cybernetics project outside the US, years ahead of its time, which is still recognized for that. He was a political prisoner under Pinochet. 8 Nobel Prize winners approached Pinochet to petition for Fernando's release, which was one of the reasons he got released from jail. He went to California and he wrote a groundbreaking book called Understanding Computers and Cognition. And part of what he and his partner were doing was debunking the notion of AI and its similarity with human intelligence. And that book was the foundation of many of the companies that are dominant in the world today, Google, LinkedIn being two. Fernando's a friend, business partner for 30 years, and an entrepreneur. I don't know if any of you've had the privilege of coaching a sports team, but there's a moment as a coach before an important knockout game when it's you and the team, and I call them sacred moments. You get a few words with the team and they go out on the pitch and you as the coach stay there, and they're very special. And I have that sense a little bit about this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to throw in the ball, and please give a big welcome to Adam Tooze.
Well, good evening. It's an enormous pleasure to be with you here again. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Billy. It's a real privilege to be part of these events, because you're right. I mean, I do think we've been living through times which are unprecedented in their intensity. Maybe perhaps not quite 1917 level. I love meetings of business people where Lenin is invoked early on in the evening. But nevertheless, it has felt like a kind of rolling barrage of complexity and difficulty. And it's in that kind of setting, you need good company. You need fellow travelers. You need companions to go on the march with. And it really is a privilege to be working with Billy and the team, and by way of Billy to have met Fernando Flores, who is indeed a legend of modern thought, modern social thought. And if you want to hear more about the background there, there's a podcast that's just been released on all the obvious venues, Apple, Spotify, on the cybernetics project in socialist Chile that you can download from there, put together by the brilliant Evgeny Morozov. And I highly recommend that to you. I mean, it's a fascinating thing to be involved in these conversations, because business, whether it likes it or not, is at the cutting edge, on the coalface, caught up in the maelstrom of the current moment. And I don't envy you, frankly, the roles of leadership that you have at this point. The more I go in life as a highly privileged ivory tower academic, the more I come to appreciate the privileges that go with it. And it isn't a quiet life, but I don't at least face the kind of really barrage of problems that any group of senior business leaders have faced in recent years. And there is a sense in which, whichever way you turn, you face political and social pressures of a type that you have not faced for a long time, over issues that go into the very guts of the business on pricing. You see the politicization of what used to be simply a kind of technical, logistical operation, the supply chain. And at the same time, you see the avaricious, almost incessant demands for business to deliver, to perform the giant investments, which we all know are necessary for the survival of our culture, our civilization, our societies as we know them, in the forefront of that being the green energy transition that we have to perform. And really what I want to spend the next 25 minutes talking about is how we've come to this situation, and think with you and offer some pointers as to how we might think about the dilemmas this raises. Because one can't help but think of Jamie Dimon's immortal words from the financial markets, where he said rather grumpily in 2012 that carrying on doing the trading floor business at JP Morgan, you needed the sound counsel simultaneously of a lawyer and a psychiatrist. And I think that is actually not a bad set of suggestions in our current moment. We should take the mood seriously, as well as its legal implications. I think whenever I speak to business folks and leadership at this current moment, there is also a slight sense of kind of slight wounded pride. Because there's a sense in which the business community, the most, advanced edges of the business community, notably in the West over the last decades, feels that it's been on a journey to enlightenment, right? Because you started with shareholder value. This was the great learning of the 1980s, the 1990s, the crisp focus on delivery of shareholder value, the new religion of the corporate world from the 80s onwards. No more of these conglomerates with all of this self-serving delivery, this hubristic assessment by the business managers of the big corporations. They could define where the path lay. No, focus on objectives. And at some point, of course, it became obvious that that was not enough. And this was the step that was then made into the brave new world of ESG. And ESG changed the game in many ways at an operational level in many companies, right? It's been knocked. There's an entire industry you can go to after dinner speeches in which ESG and especially ethical investing is derided. I think it's important to make the distinction then the same thing, because at the operational level, ESG really needs to be part of everyone's lifeblood. But it has been a transformative effort to change the way in which business thinks. And it's been hugely productive, I think, in simply broadening the range of the optic, right? The range of considerations and criteria that have to be taken into account at any given moment. And I think the bewilderment of the current moment is that we seem to be entering a new phase in which even this expandic matrix with all of these criteria on it and all of this complex grid that people have worked so hard to train themselves and their organizations to address, and really address not in a symbolic way, but deep in the organizational culture. And then you run up against the maelstrom of the last 2 to 3 years, and you're dealing with pandemics, you're dealing with war, you're dealing with inflation and the cost of living crisis, which politicizes the prices mechanism in a way we haven't seen in decades. You're dealing with political systems which are polarized to the point at which they become barely functional. And we are seeing, and I'm just putting it here as a cipher, beyond war, a rending, a tearing apart at the seams of the fabric of what globalization really amounted to since the 1990s, which at its core is the Sino-US, European-China relationship. That triangle defined what globalization really is. And now that is not on the ESG map as such, right? And really the question is, how does one begin to navigate in this space? And a group of folks, of which I find myself, somewhat to my surprise, as previously having been an ivory tower historian, find myself in the middle of, have been trying to grapple with this as a sense in real time, as a historical shift, because it kind of quacks like that, walks like that, smells a little bit like a historical shift at this point. It does feel like one of these moments at which history accelerates. And the term that we have, several of us, globbed onto, not entirely uncontroversially, but in a sense, last year at least, it required a momentum which went beyond individual egos, is the idea of polycrisis. The idea that what we're facing right now is not one crisis, but the multiplication of crises and their interaction in ways that we haven't seen like this before. If you want to sit on one single axis, it would be the great acceleration, the hockey stick, the sudden and dramatic transformation of the entire environmental envelope, which is going on all around us, not in the future, but right now in large parts of the world as we speak. But there are so many other facets to it. And it has been taken up by Martin Wolf as a key term. It's been taken up by Larry Summers. That's what LS stands for here. The three of us have all been thinking in the same direction about how we try and encompass this phase, which appears to be beyond the frame that we were so familiar with for several decades, which forces us to deal simultaneously with a list like this. Massive geopolitical tension, climate change, and as it were, central driver of our understanding, but not just as it were individual environmental problems, but the basic parameters of our relationship with the environmental context, envelope, backdrop that we've taken so granted for so long are at risk. Other quote-unquote environmental shocks. So the pandemic as the result of zoonotic mutation. The pandemic is the result of the unmanaged, convulsive modernization of Chinese society, not lab leak. Though lab leak could really fit in this thesis, lab leak would simply be the question of a sort of runaway scientific experiment, part of this same process. But really the incredible churning transformation of Chinese society, 500 to 600 million people urbanizing, this creates a series of interfaces between humanity and nature which are profoundly dangerous, and everyone for the half a century has been pointing to them as a source of potential risk. Macroeconomic imbalances of a scale that we have not seen in a while, and political radicalization and polarization. Now, when you look at that list, and this is the key point about the polycrisis argument, each one of those bits is in a sense familiar and has a logic which a sub-discipline of social science or biological science has devoted itself. And then when you put the list together, it just looks like a bad list. If I was a tutor at Cambridge College, I would say this is a laundry list of an essay. This is just a series of points, A, B, C, D, E. They appear not to have any logical connection to each other. But that, ladies and gentlemen, appears to be precisely the character of our current moment. The polycrisis term is precisely trying to capture the somewhat dazzling, this is what, as Larry Summers picked out by saying they were disparate, incoherent shocks that characterize the current moment. One way I think about this when I'm in a sort of more flippant mode is I'll say it's like a buffet, right? You go down to breakfast in the morning, you expect there to be a buffet. That's like a regular historical crisis. You expect it to have several different dimensions, right? But the thing about a buffet is you expect it also to have a kind of logic, right? You expect the croissant to be here, and then you move by way of the waffles and the eggs to the bacon on the left-hand side. And that's what a well-organized buffet looks like. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what a comprehensible historical crisis looks like. The variety and differentiation, but according to a pattern that's kind of familiar and, if you'll allow the kind of aesthetic reference, has a kind of taste to it. And the problem of the polycrisis is it's offal and French fries and waffles and strawberries all next to each other on the same buffet. And in intellectual terms, we really don't have a name for that. There's no cuisine. We don't really have a good description of what a crisis looks like in which a pandemic causes the US Treasury market to blow up. That isn't on anyone's bingo card. Those connections aren't there in anyone's head, right? We do not really have a strategy for how you adjust your climate policy in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We have to do it. We have to scramble. But again, that was on no one's bingo card with regards to the problems we thought we would face. And that's what this notion of polycrisis is trying to get at, this sudden heterogeneity, this sudden breakdown of the familiar cuisine with which we interpret history. Another reason why we're not really in Lenin's space unless we got into an exegesis. And you could say that he was the ultimate fusion chef, but that's maybe a different topic for a different time. I've tried to map it in maps like this, a kind of crisis diagram, I've called it. It's kind of like a spider graph, like an inside of your head kind of laying out of your worst nightmares. It's not for nothing, I think, that surrealism has made a huge comeback in the modern art scene, because the surrealists of the interwar period were also trying to explore the inner working and inner logic of a period of chaos. And these kind of diagrams were often drawn and painted by them. And when I do this, one of the pushbacks, and this thesis has a pushback, and I expect to get pushback this evening as well, one of the pushbacks is Tooze, you're just a freaked out liberal intellectual. He's lost his way and doesn't really understand what's going on. What you're doing is projecting onto the world your inner demons, and you're in a funk, basically, and that's what you're telling us. And then you pause and you kind of go, well, yeah. And the next response is, and you're not. Like, you're feeling good about the way this is all going. Like, the pushback is, well, if you're not in a funk, you really haven't smelled the coffee and you've not woken up and you've not faced this. And in any case, however you're feeling and however superior you be made feeling at that moment, what do you think out there the mood is? Fernando Flores and I were talking about this earlier on. I don't think it's deniable at this point that out there is a polycrisis mood. Out there is a polycrisis anxiety. In your customers, in your staff, in the media, there is a sense of profound anxiety and disturbance. And how can any of us forget that shock that you were just describing, Billy, so effectively in March 2020, like that rippled through society? I think last time I told the story of the bond trader I interviewed who was in Hong Kong and had failed to sell a package of $2.5 billion in US treasuries on an afternoon in the second week of March, and stumbled out of his office building and looked at all of the other buildings and said, well, if those assets are no longer liquid, are there any assets in the world that are? Any assets in the world? If I can't offload $2.5 billion of treasuries in an afternoon from Hong Kong, we're done, right? The whole structure goes. And that's a very kind of high level instance of this kind of anxiety. But if you teach, if you employ people, if you work with teams, if you've had to cope with this in your own families, who doesn't know this feeling of stress? So I own this. I don't see that as a problem. Any kind of tools, conceptual and otherwise, that we have for grasping precisely this reality of disturbance and doing justice to it brings us closer to actually dealing with what Billy was so flatteringly describing as what I see as the real challenge in the current moment, which is actually to live and think history at the same time. And part of that is dealing with our own emotional states. But it is also political, and it brings you into the frame not just as people with families and lives that are being disrupted by these shocks, but it brings you into the frame also as organizations in the public realm. Business is not just experiencing this, you are in the picture. Right? This is not just a picture of the world that you confront as a set of parameters that are around you. It's coming at you, it's inside you, and it's coming at you from the outside. And business has been politicized in ways in recent years which I think are novel and painful and difficult. And this stuff, even in a room like this, is not easy to talk about. So I'm going to be quite careful about the topics I raise and examples I show from bitter experience in talking in Texas, or slightly more cautious experience of talking in Hong Kong, right? And there is a huge elephant in any room in the British Isles right now that I'm not going to go next to, but I think you'll see where we go with this. From the left, what you're going to hear is that business is responsible because you dragged your feet on climate and because you to this day engage in greenwashing, and they don't trust you any further than they can throw you, and that's not very far. Because fundamentally they think you've got mixed motives and they're not headed in the same direction. Right? So that's, as it were, the accusation that comes from the left. From the right, and it's relatively novel, but it's a marker of the times, you'll get the accusation that liberal business elites like yourselves have sold out to woke. Right? You're all Romaniacs at heart. Again, because, you may be patriotic card-carrying Brits or whatever, but fundamentally your business interests point in a different direction, so you can't be trusted. Right? So these are these two tensions from both sides. And you can multiply examples of this across different realms and different societies. Both sides will converge on the fact that you are profiteers of the age of globalization, which generated huge inequality and the current problems in the socio-economic system. And more than that, not just profiteers, but the more or less hidden and veiled agents that drove it. So they infer and impute to you both the advantage of, taking advantage of this situation and actually being causal agents in driving this. And you don't have to take this from me. You can just watch any newscast in the United States right now, see it being acted out. And if you ask about the composition of the Biden administration, and I'll just talk about the US right now, you'll see the logic of this. There hasn't been a moment in American history in which folks like yourselves had less direct influence on the administration of the American government than you do right now. Right? And there certainly hasn't been a democratic administration since maybe Carter at his most radical in the 1970s, in which folks like yourselves had less influence. Look at China policy if you want an instance of it. Look at Janet Yellen's speech on China that she gave last week. So you could say to yourselves, well, okay, we want to step back from politics. We don't want to have anything to do with it. This is dangerous, right? All sides hate us, and we've really got to step away. But the problem is you can't. The problem is you can't, because in the age of polycrisis, again and again and again, in interventions which inescapably matter, the public sector, the giant balance sheet of the public sector, politics has to intervene. So we're in a situation in which we kind of can't live with each other, and yet we somehow have to. And really mapping that is what I really want to end by doing today. Not only are we in a world in which, as it were, whether we like it or not, we're crucially dependent on the state and government to provide essential stabilizing functions when things get real. But those interventions themselves then induce what you could call second-order crises. So we're in a world in which on top of the pandemic, which is killing people and putting people's lives in jeopardy, remember we just didn't know how many people this disease was going to kill and who it was going to kill and how. The problem we end up dealing with are the fallout effects from the lockdown policies that were necessary to contain the pandemic risk and save the health service, according to our calculation. On top of the rise of China as such, the problem for large parts of globalized business in the world today are the responses of the states, respectively, in China and the United States to that phenomenon, right? So the jarring reallocation of resources within the world will be one thing, but what you're now having to deal with is the response of the American national security state to China's rise. A whole other set of problems that arise from that, legal, political, economic, and opportunities, of course, as well. On top of the climate crisis as such, what everyone in the business community has to calculate is the so-called transition risk in Mark Carney's famous typology of risks, which is the probability that unless we act quickly and swiftly now to contain the crisis, at some point a shock will arrive, a little bit like the pandemic, you might say, that will force such rapid action that we will end up with super inefficient transition paths and massive stranded asset risk. Right? So it won't be the climate crisis per se, it's the reaction of politics to it. Or think, for instance, of the German energy sector and Angela Merkel's move after Fukushima on nuclear. They had a very, very complicated compromise worked out in the early 2000s. Then Fukushima comes along. Angela Merkel, not normally known for rapid responses, flips on the nuclear switch, and the German utility sector still hasn't recovered from the shock that delivered. Those kind of risks are out there everywhere. In fact, looking at this now, you can't help thinking to yourself, my God, how did we sustain this world in which all we had to worry about were profits on the one hand and shareholder value and ESG on the other? How did we lose that world? Well, I think, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that was the world which is now generally referred to as the world of neoliberalism. Both sides, both the ESG and the shareholder values, was a world in which business could do business things, so, super focus, laser focus on shareholder value and operational, as it were, tasks around ESG, whilst privatization, many of the businesses in this room are the product of that privatization drives of the 80s and 1990s, whilst market solutions, whilst WTO-type trade orders, whilst carbon pricing, for instance, all of these mechanisms have in common that they are indirect ways of governing the economy, which then leave up to the private businesses in question choices with, for instance, with regard to technology. Think about the importance of technological neutrality in European energy and environmental policy. The idea is set the parameters right and then leave it up to you folks to make the decisions. That, unfortunately, is no longer our world. We're in a world now of direct intervention, of industrial policy, of specific targeted interventions. But it's also a world from which you can't escape, which you are tied into by the necessity and the functional power and the services that you deliver. A world in which we are doing friendshoring, a world in which we are doing vaccine races, a world in which we are doing leveling up, and a world in which we are doing green industrial policy is not a world in which business gets to retreat from its relationship with business, right? This is a world in which you are continuously sucked back into an engagement with business which is so much more difficult and on a much more urgent timescale, in which technological neutrality and business choice and delegation cannot be taken for granted, and in which much more than basic external parameters are going to be set, and in which the challenges of politicization are going to come at you whether you like it or not. It's in fact an incredibly entangled relationship. I describe it as something like a spiral. I haven't quite got the right spiral graphics yet, but it's something like this. If you were a government embarking on wanting to do green industrial policy or a vaccine race or something like that, you can't do it yourself. You need business to deliver. And what do you need business for? You need business for expertise, for operational competence, and for resource mobilization, right? These are the three things that business is going to deliver for politics. So what does business need? Well, business needs things from politics too. We need to remap this relationship. And this, I think, is something like the outline of it. Well, business is going to need from politics leadership and clarity of vision, societal license to operate, which is what politics can mobilize for you. It can set the rules and anchor those in majorities. A stable and favorable regulatory environment, which allows you to actually mobilize resource, because you can't do it without that. And ultimately, access to the public balance sheet as the fundamental de-risking, and perfectly legitimately so, the de-risking resource par excellence, where we can, in the end, handle even the sort of catastrophic macroeconomic risks we saw in 2020. Those you can only really put on a public balance sheet. It doesn't make sense to try and privately insure for those en masse. So then the question really is, if this is what business is going to need from politics, what is politics going to need back from you? Right? As we move down this spiral, where are we going to go? Where are we headed? And I don't think we know the answer to that yet, which is why this is such an interesting moment. We're not in a regime which we can easily describe the precise and general properties of. And it's furthermore a regime which probably is not technologically neutral. In other words, if we go down one route, it may prejudice and change all of the options that we have, and we may not be able to get back big plays, like on hydrogen, for instance. 100 billion, globally, $1 trillion plays shape the way in which we move. And we don't know, and they won't be able to ever access the alternative histories that we could have accessed if we went another route, right? So when we explore this together, and when we try and figure this out, we have to open our minds to thinking more like historians or anthropologists, or biologists than physicists who are trying to define the optimal overall properties of systems which have true regularity. I don't think that's our world. But let me give you like 5 things perhaps that we maybe know so far, and then maybe we can explore much more in the panel afterwards. I think the first thing to realize is don't expect any thanks, right? So think about the pharma industry. The vaccine race. I mean, it is flat out one of the most dramatic miracles of R&D and human achievement, full stop. And without it, we wouldn't be here this evening. We wouldn't have been here last year, right? It was literally the progress of those vaccines through our bodies that got us there. And it was a triumph of a combination of public-private partnership. It was a kind of rapid-fire industrial policy. It was a whatever it goes in the vaccine space, moonshot. It wasn't really expensive by the standards of the sort of thing we happen to do in the green energy space. But nevertheless, tens of billions of dollars, euros were being lashed out. And we had no good reason to think we were going to be able to do it for sure, but we didn't really have an option. And we ended up triumphantly with a whole suite of vaccines. Now, as you'd think that the pharma industry will be riding high on the kind of wave of humanity's appreciation for the remarkable stuff that they do. And of course, as you know, they're not, right? In Europe in particular, they're currently facing a major effort to rewrite the rules. Now, we don't need to go into the rights and wrongs of generic drug pricing in Europe this evening, though people may have strong views about it. The point is that there is no quick payback here, and even gigantic successes that literally transform society and enable us all to carry on our ordinary lives are not going to carry through in any simple, straightforward way into rounds of applause and decades of legitimacy for what you do as business people. And you're just, I think, going to have to suck that up and live with it and learn the attitudinal, psychological stances that will allow you to cope with a relationship. If not abusive, it's certainly going to be tough. Right? This relationship between business and politics, capitalism and democracy is not going to be an easy one, but it's a necessary one we can't really escape. So I think that's one thing we probably know at this point. Another point that's really fascinating, I think, and this is an example I'm really seized by, and it may seem a little remote, but if you kind of think laterally, I think you'll see the significance of it, are the dangers involved in strategies of trying to avoid this issue of politics. So that my favorite example for many years, I'm sure many of you will have encountered this, if you talk to colleagues who were involved in China, you'd ask them, okay, so how do you manage the risks of being involved in China? Even before 2020, it was obvious there were risks. And a classic answer was to say, well, we focus on the central growth story, we focus on the Chinese middle class, we focus on health, education, those kind of issues. We think they're low salience in terms of politics. You know, what could possibly go wrong with selling high-valued educational services to ambitious middle-class people? Like, you know, that's clearly a surefire winner. This was from June 2019, this prediction, and it made perfect sense in June 2019. This was going to be a $50 billion growth market until Xi Jinping comes along and announces, no, the aim of Chinese society is common prosperity, and Western, highly leveraged, literally, market-floated private tutoring organizations did not have a place in China's future. And all of a sudden, literally within weeks, this market, this business sector collapsed, huge losses to these businesses. Now, you could look at that and say, oh, well, we know what this story is. This is authoritarianism. This is autocracy. It's totally capricious. You shouldn't do business there. Fine, walk away, no issue. Look at it from a different vantage point. And what are the Chinese saying? We think you're a business betting on inequality. What you are doing is selling high-valued service to the Chinese who can afford them, through which then their children will replicate the social and cultural advantages their parents already have. And we don't think, in the interest of Chinese social stability, and of course also the rule of the Communist Party, that that's a good thing that we're going to permit it. And at that point, I think this example takes on a salience which is much broader, right? Because what happened there is that Western companies got called on a social engineering project that was going to be extremely profitable for them, and was going to harness their business future to the future of aspirant, socially mobile, upwardly mobile Chinese people. And that was a good generic play, because those people exist and those people are a dynamic market, and you can see where they went that way. But remember the second order crisis point, right? The second order crisis point is somebody can see your strategy coming and calls you on it. And that, I think, is a really interesting phenomenon. Another case in point is ESG. Now, how could you possibly go wrong with ESG? It's all the good stuff in a great big package until you try and do it say, in the largest and most important economic powerhouse of the United States other than California, which is Texas, which has now just passed a raft of legislation banning interaction between public financial bodies and any American actor, financial actor in particular, that professes completely commonplace ESG rules in its business plans. Right? So again, you could say capricious American politics, these crazy Republicans, God knows what else they're going to get up to, and God love us, they have gotten up to a range of other things. But essentially, outlawing not just abortion, but even the taxi driver who takes the woman in pursuit of an abortion is liable for prosecution by a private individual in Texas. It's an absolutely a kind of Margaret Atwood hell. They also tried to abolish tenure for academics, by the way. That's their latest aberration. So you could say, like, it's crazy Texans doing their thing. It's part of that politicization spiral. Another way of thinking about this was, and this is what the conservatives will tell you, no, what we're doing is calling a bunch of liberal coastal elites on their presumptuous effort to smuggle essentially political choices into business practices without democratic mandate. And I have a democratic mandate, and I've looked at what you do, and I actually disagree with you about the salience of the climate and don't want you to prioritize it in any kind of dealings with public money. And as a fully democratically legitimated representative of the proud state of Texas, I'm going to deny you the right to smuggle your agenda in. So if you want to bring that agenda, that's fine, but you better win the vote in Texas before you do that, because otherwise you can't. Right? And it's, again, I think, another instance, a bit like the Chinese one, of an agenda that's implicit and remains unspoken and wasn't politicized and fought out, which then gets called in a really destabilizing way. Okay, so let's end with another example. So you keep thinking down these tracks. And no, I'm not going to go to Brexit. Let's keep on thinking down these tracks. Let's go to something much more upbeat than that. Greatest act of environmental legislation the United States has ever passed. Arguably any nation in the world has ever passed, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is now dynamizing industrial policy all over the world. It's unleashed this avalanche. It's changed the world. How did it happen? Yeah. Great. Now you like it. It's an amazing thing, right? And Europeans will be scornful about it for various reasons, and I'll tell you some in just a second, but it's an amazing powerhouse thing, and it is going to make America into a champion of green energy. And the funny thing about it is, how does it come about? Well, one thing you have to do is squeeze it through the thinnest of all possible needleheads, which is Joe Manchin's set of preferences, the senator for the coal state of West Virginia, which really limits what you can do. But the other thing that got us there was a huge mobilization of progressive green energy lobbying by American business interests in the critical second and third weeks of July 2022, when they realized that the third major effort to pass climate legislation in the history of American democracy, going back to Bill Clinton, was about to founder unless they spoke up and told American business, told American politics, we're here too. And what we stand for is the future, we think, of American industry and American energy, and we want our interests to be counted alongside those of Exxon, and we actually think they weigh heavily in the balance, and we're going to challenge you and call you on whether you think they are. And that's what got this through to a very considerable extent, was a mobilization of business lobbying around the Inflation Reduction Act. So on the one hand, we cheer, this is fantastic, it really has, it's transformed the entire game. But what did it come out of? It came out of the self-interested actions of a lobbying organization on behalf of American industry. You can actually see it in the numbers, this surge in Inflation Reduction Act numbers. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is another way of responding to this crisis. It's saying, I think there's a future out there. I think it must be shaped like this. I'm going to identify my particular interest with the general interest, and I'm going to goddamn go for it and make the case in public. But of course, what you do is expose yourself and the legislation to the accusation that it is precisely you again, the people who made neoliberalism, the people who made globalization, the people who both profited and drove it, who are now profiting and driving it again. Right? But there's no escape. This is the biggest piece of legislation ever. And my folks, my progressive democratic think tankers who engineered this, deliberately unveiled those interests. They built that coalition and they said, this is not clean hands politics. This is where Lenin comes in. We're not waiting for the real green revolution to arrive. We're going to make a revolution out of whatever material we can that's just available. And he made a socialist state of sorts out of peasants. And they're going to make a green revolutionary politics out of American business interests. And that's what they're attempting to do. This is messy stuff is the message that we have to come to. And I think then let me leave you, though, with a slightly more kind of unambiguous answer. I think there's another way of responding to this, and we're beginning to see this around the business world, and we will have people in the room who are engaged in this kind of thinking. Another way of thinking about this is to say, look, sure, we can engage in these very complex, very high-risk political gambles. We can try and explicate. We can try and go underneath the radar and do this without politics, or we can go up and try and be part of the majority that gets this done. We can try and fight cases and win them, or we could simply say, looking at our business, what can we do right here, right now, that will change the game and open up technological doors to the future? What is it that we can actually move on? Given a certain environmental and given a certain regulatory context, of course, but what is it that we can act on? And the example I would give, it's one that we could cite of many, is Maersk's decision, for instance, to be a first mover in pioneering low-carbon, long-range containerization. Now, we all know this is a hard-to-abate sector, and there are very difficult choices to be made here, and they are making a contentious choice, I think, in some ways, to go with methanol now and not wait for the even better ammonia options, which may be down the line. But this, I think, is another way for business to respond to the multiples of crises that are out there, which is to try and use your technological competence, use your leverage to create facts on the ground, to shape technological paths ahead, perhaps, of the environmental, regulatory and political game, to define, as it were, what the options are out there for potentially subsequent political choice. Take agency, assume the responsibility. It, of course, involves a gamble. You could do it if you're an extraordinarily well-resourced, powerful firm like them. Other players may not be in this position, but this too is something, I think, that one of the ways in which business can respond to this situation. Let me sum up and let me stand back and then look forward very much to the conversation. Let me sum up by thinking and also drawing on some of the things I've learned from conversations with Billy and Fernando and others on the vision team. What is it that business is going to need to cope with this crisis? Well, one thing is clearly complex, flexible, strategic thinking, right? There's going to have to be a macro component to the response, thinking through the scale of the challenge, thinking through its implications. That, if you could say, is a kind of a top-down kind of dimension to this. As I said, you need, I think, to continuously look around the corner. That, for me, is the example of the Chinese education model. That's, you could really have seen that possibility, but it required you to be willing to shift the ideas of the political parameters with which you operated. But in a sense, do a stress test the robustness of your business model in relation to someone shifting one of the fundamental parameters, that inequality is something that they will accept or not. I do think, and I meant it seriously, though I said it flippantly, but I think it's serious. You do need to develop a toughness for this interaction, because this isn't going to be the hands-off, standoff, arm's length set of relationships that we became familiar with from the 1990s and the 2000s, right? Where there was something like a technological neutrality assumption. We'll set prices and then you act. This is not the world that we're in anymore, and so this is going to be rough and tumble, and you're dealing with a system, the political system, that takes no prisoners and will consistently use other parts of the system. And you can say this about the public service as a civil servant, or as businesses, it'll look to outsource responsibility, and you need to be prepared for that. But fundamentally, you have to hang in the relationship, because though it may seem at times impossible for business and politics to live together, there's really no alternative. There's no way forward from this. There's no revolutionary out. All we have is this messy marriage that we've somehow got to make work, right? There's no getting off the bus, and there's no way out. And I think, therefore, it also pays, and this is one of the things I've really heard and learned from listening to Billy talk about the work that Vision does. You do need to look inside the organization, because this polycrisis is not just happening in your personal head, and it's not just happening at the macro level. It's happening inside your organization, in the lives, in the careers, in the vision of the people that you employ, your team members, and from their perspective. And an organization, I think, which successfully responds to this is going to do so in large part because it mobilizes the energy, the resource, the perception, the awareness of the world of people throughout at literally every single level. If you think, for instance, about the COVID crisis and the lessons that we learned there, about basic functions like cleaning, that suddenly became absolutely essential to the operation of all organizations. I think that should be a humbling lesson as to our assumptions about what matters in systems, in big complex systems. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward very much to the conversation.